I had one last story left to find before I completed my documentary project, and that was the widow of Balbir Singh Sodhi, the first man who was killed after 9/11, the story that set me on the road. And to find her, I had to go all the way to India and to take a plane, cross the oceans, cross the continents, land in Delhi, take 9 hours to travel through the fields of Punjab, past these villages, through open fields, until I asked her, finally, one question. What would you tell the people of America? And I was expecting anger, I was expecting hate, I was expecting resentment. So after all, this is what I was beginning to feel after hearing all these stories of violence. And she leans over and says to me, thank you. Tell them thank you. When I went to Phoenix for my husband's funeral, they came out in the thousands, and they sat with me, and they wept with me. Hindus, Muslims, Siks, Christians. Tell them thank you for caring. And that's when I realized that there are very few people in the world whose faces are so hardened by hate that they can't be transformed by our stories. That the Phoenix community came out in the hundreds and the thousands because they had heard Balbir Singh Sodhi's story. His story wasn't told to national news. The community did a very good job of telling his story there in Phoenix that brought together an entire city. That stories have the power to break down the wall dividing us and them. Stories indeed can set us free. The last story. While I was on the road, I met a Sikh man in the Bay Area who had 3 different things happen to him. This was my professor at one point, this Sikh professor at San Jose State University. And the first thing that happened to him, he was on a bus when someone began to yell at him to go back to his country, and he quickly got off the bus and he was safe. The second time, he was standing with his wife when a group of kids came by and threw skateboards at him and his wife and called them Afghanis, and he barely got away. The third time was different. The third time, my professor again was on a bus, sitting by a window, when a man at the front of the bus stood up, turned around, red in the face, and began yelling at my professor, "Hey, you effing terrorists, get off this bus, go back to your country." And my professor, sort of accustomed to being quiet in these moments, just kept looking out the window, hoping, praying for the moment to pass. When something remarkable began to happen, the other people on the bus began to stand up. The white man, the Asian girl, the black kid. They all stood up and they took this man's arm and they said, sit down, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about. Sit down. And the man sat down. And the bus comes to a stop. And the professor gets off this bus, and the man gets off this bus, and the man comes up to my professor and puts out his arm, and at this point, I know this moment in the story. I'm ready to cry, my stomach is tight, I'm ready for the violence to happen. Give it to me. And the man takes my professor's hand and shakes it and says, "I'm so sorry. My granddaughter was just killed on that second plane that went into that second tower. I'm angry. I'm sorry." And what has stayed with me about that story is not necessarily the man's transformation, which is itself pretty powerful, but it's the people on that bus. We are the people on that bus. We are the people who can stand up in the most ordinary of circumstances and say and do the most extraordinary of things to fight for the kind of country, the kind of community that we believe in.
Dahr Jamail grew up in Houston and lives in Alaska. He has reported frequently from Iraq, wrote a book called Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq. His new book is The Will to Resist: Soldiers Who Refuse to Fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. It comes out at a time when soldiers like Victor Augusto are refusing to fight in Obama's Afghanistan war. This is from an interview I did with him in 2005, and we talk about Fallujah, Iraq.
I was in Fallujah in April during the first siege of the city. I spent a couple of days in there, and then I went back in May several times to document what happened during the siege. And then the November siege, it was impossible to get in the city, so I covered that one by interviewing doctors and Fallujah refugees.
Let's try to remember back. The reason supposedly for the first siege was some contractors had been killed and then their bodies mutilated, and this enraged the military, and so they went after Fallujah, but then that siege did not succeed.
Right. That siege, actually, even after what happened to those 4 mercenaries, the military commander in charge of Fallujah still didn't want to go in. He actually preferred working on reconstruction projects and trying to win the people's trust that way. That the order to siege the city actually didn't come through the military like the invasion of Iraq. It came through the White House directly. And that siege did fail because the military realized pretty quickly that they weren't going to be able to take the city without destroying most of it, which is what happened in November.
So what did you see when you were there in Fallujah?
When I was in there in April, what I saw was, and I went in during a so-called ceasefire, according to Paul Bremer, the administrator of Iraq at that time of the CPA. And so we figured that we knew it would be dangerous, but if you're going to go in, you might as well go in during a ceasefire. And it was anything but a ceasefire. There were warplanes bombing the city when we went in and fighting all over the city. And we took supplies into a small clinic inside the city, which is how we got in. And there were one person after another being brought into the clinic, women, children, older people, all of them civilians, and they were all claiming the same thing, that wherever they were in the city, they were being shot by snipers, by military snipers. The ambulance had one functional ambulance left, and it even had some bullet holes in it because all their others had been destroyed by the military. So it was a massacre is really the word I would use to describe what I saw in April, and that was really just a bit of a prelude as to what happened in November, where at least 4,000 people were killed in Fallujah.
Jamail will be speaking in Hartford's Bushnell Park Sunday, September 20th. For more details, go to our website, thestruggle.org. That's our show for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
We've got a situation and it calls for a solution that upholds our domination of the planet. We're gonna make our case and we're gonna make it well. And if you don't like our logic, you can it. We'll use impeccable intelligence from any